아무튼 전혜림 선생님입니다. 저희 학생들이 2월 동안 되게 열심히 포럼 준비를 했어요. 지금 12월 달에는 다 온라인해서 조금 정신 없었지만 애들은 되게 열심히 해서 조금 잘 부탁드립니다. 저희 첫 번째 그룹은 스티그마 그룹이에요.
소개부터 하고. 마이크에 좀 가까이 대주세요.
Hi, my name is Judith Lee and I am the leader of the Stigma group. Stigma Surrounding Mental Health in South Korea by Judith Lee. Matthew Lee, Michelle Choi, and Jamie.
What is stigma? Stigma is a mark of disgrace. It's a negative attitude based on distinguished characteristics of mental health. Stigma is discrimination to those with a different attribute, and some synonyms for stigma is shame, disgrace, and so on. There are three main types of stigma surrounding mental health. The first example is public. This is general society's public opinion on the mentally ill. An example of this is when mental illness is seen as a sign of weakness. The second type of stigma is institutional. It's where government and private organizations limit the mentally ill's rights and availability. An example of this is when an insurance company denies someone with depression insurance and rejects their claim. Lastly, the third type of stigma is self-stigma. This is the mentally ill's negative opinion on themselves, and it's also known as self-blame. An example of this is when someone who is depressed blames themselves for their depression and thinks they're worthless. In South Korea, there's usually a negative perception of mental illness, and it's viewed as psychotic and abnormal. Mental illness is often linked with shame, and this social stigma remains common throughout the South Korean population. But the big question is why? Why does this stigma of mental illness exist? So why do South Koreans have such a negative perception of mental illness?
마이크가 안 되는 것 같아요. 가까이
Matthew, there's a volume button on the bottom. If you look on the bottom, the mic volume. Turn it up.
Okay, but the big question is why? Why does this stigma of mental health exist? And why do South Koreans have such a negative perception of mental illness? The answer is the culture, their societal and family beliefs in South Korea. South Korea is known as the Pali Pali society, and they are known to be fast, perfect, and accurate. And South Korea is a fast-growing and working society. However, there is no work-to-life balance, and this can be shown on the graph to the left. This graph shows the country with the worst work-to-life balance in 2020. And on this list, South Korea is on the higher end of this list, being ranked number 7 out of 38. And South Korea has an engraved mentality to always be perfect, called the perfectionist mindset. And this mindset is deeply rooted in the public conscience. And because of this, mental health awareness and advocacy done by Korean physicians are largely ineffective.
Due to these negative attitudes toward mental health services, due to these Korean beliefs, the mentality of Koreans living in America is heavily affected. For example, the negative attitudes toward mental health services create greater depressive symptoms. Not only is this mainly due to the prejudice and about having mental illness itself, but also the barrier that people cannot receive. So depressive symptoms functions as a barrier rather than a need. Another belief that is implemented in Korea's mentality is the word chemyeon. This translates to family pride or honor, which must be maintained at all costs in the traditional Korean society. Just as the closure of mental illness, physical disability, or other weaknesses in the family lineage is the basis for social ostracism amongst the Korean American community. This serious loss of status can even cause a sibling of a mentally ill person unable to marry. It is a social imperative to maintain family honor by hiding these shameful secrets. Here in this graph shows a 2005 study in Tampa and Orlando, Florida, with 472 Korean Americans from ages 60 to 94 reporting how they perceived mental health. As you can see, 71% perceived depression as a sign of personal weakness, 51% thought that becoming depressed was a normal process of aging, and 14% reported that having a mentally ill family member brought shame to the whole family. This shows that the older generation has a lack of knowledge for mental illness and the stigma that having a mental illness was shameful and weak.
So within South Korea, there are several drivers of decreasing mental health status. With South Korea having extremely stressful culture surrounding work, life, and familial affairs, this leads to unemployment rates 3 times that of the national average. This high competitive drive that South Koreans take on makes the job industry extremely competitive and hard to acquire jobs for oneself, as there's so much competition within an application pool. When some are met with unemployment during this application process, this can also bring them under financial burdens as they continuously struggle to find a job for themselves. Decreasing mental health issues can also be attributed to competitive drive itself, as this stressful work culture brings many to spiral down mental health issues due to societal pressures. Now, as this job-seeking process is so stressful, competitive, and complicated, this has led to over 40% of the South Korean younger generation to quit job seeking in general. In an attempt to avoid and stay away from unfriendly and stressful work culture, these younger generations have been straying away from looking for their own jobs within society. Moreover, as mentioned before, some can simply just not attain jobs as in the first place due to such high competition rates in Korea. As these people stop seeking or fail to attain jobs themselves, financial burdens begin to weigh on their lives, increasing mental stress and burden on their lives. This can lead to depression, extreme anxiety, and overall other mental health problems that will weigh in on their lives. Alongside this, South Korea has strong societal pressures for one to find a successful job and successfully implement themselves into society. Therefore, when met with unemployment or being unable to find a job or quitting job chasing, this can lead to one being consistently pressured by those around them to find a job, and once again, this causes more mental health issues. Now, this next slide is just to visualize how these factors create a gradual build on top of each other in a sequence, beginning with the set competitive society of South Korea. To reiterate from the sequence, from the competitive society and stressful work culture that South Korea brings, it leads to higher unemployment rates due to such a complicated application pool. This then leads to younger generations of South Korea to stray away from job seeking themselves or being unable to attain their jobs in the first place, resulting in mental health issues from stressful financial burdens. The photos on the side demonstrate how those in South Korea become stuck in the job application process and are singled out once met with failure by the society around them, all due to societal stigma in South Korea.
But despite the constantly falling mental health in South Korea, there are certain barriers for those with mental illnesses in seeking psychiatric help. And they can be divided into 4 categories: structural discrimination, public prejudice, adverse drug effects, and low accessibility. Discrimination is the greatest barrier out of the 4, with 34%, and this is when the law restricts individuals suffering from mental illness to certain job professions. For example, the law in Korea prevents those with severe mental illnesses from becoming medical professionals unless a psychiatrist approves their appointment. Additionally, the employment of public officials may be legally terminated from their positions if mental illness is diagnosed. Generally, people with mental illnesses tend to be at a disadvantage when looking for jobs. The second greatest barrier in receiving psychiatric help is public prejudice, with 27.8%. Older people seem to fear public prejudice more so than the younger generations who are more concerned with structural discrimination. So in South Korea, there's a poor mental health literacy. According to the National Library of Medicine, by definition, mental health literacy is the knowledge and beliefs about mental disorders which aid their recognition, management, or prevention. This means that many South Koreans fail to recognize mental disorders and rather disregard them. And nearly 75% of South Korean elderly individuals suggest that depression and other mental health problems are a sign of weakness. So by just improving the mental health literacy in Korea, more people can become open to having psychotherapy and using psychiatric medication. The third categorized barrier is the adverse drug effects at 18.6%. These are the personal beliefs with having, such as mistrust of treatment, perceived stigma associated with having a mental disorder, and fear of involuntary admission to a hospital. Some tolerate their mental illness with the help of drug medication, but with this also comes some hesitancy because they're aware of the possible addiction, withdrawal symptoms, and dependence on such drugs. And accessibility is the last and smallest barrier in seeking psychiatric help with 16.1%. These include limited insurance coverage, high medical fees, lack of information, lack of appropriate medical services, and problems accessing services like lack of transportation to clinics that are more far away. In 2022 in Korea, only 3.9% of clinics are psychiatric, and all the medical costs are covered by the national insurance system in Korea. Medical costs are still very high in Korea, and it decreases the treatment of costs, but the total costs are still very high, like the counseling fees and medical medication fees in total. And this is just a graph to visually show how each categorized barrier really influence the mental. Here we can actually see that the mental health treatment is becoming more accessible in South Korea with more psychiatric clinics opening up. In 1984, we can see that there were 6,107 clinics, while in 2019 it dramatically rose to 78,739. But what are the results of these barriers? So in South Korea, there's a high prevalence of mental illness, but the stigma still remains. And this results in a huge treatment gap. A treatment gap is the discrepancy between the number of people who need treatment and those who actually have mental illnesses. And in 2017 in Korea, 1 in 4 suffered mental disorders, but only 1 in 10 actually received the treatment. As you can see, these are very small numbers, and that just shows how much the treatment gap is. And that's only 22% of people with a mental illness that actually do seek for help. And those who actually do seek help for their mental illnesses, they seek help from private psychiatric clinics, which so they kind of find treatment in secret. So they even go to lengths of paying their bills in cash so that they don't have to, like, there are no records that remain of them going to such hospitals.
Due to these social prejudices, pressures, and barriers surrounding mental health, there's a high mortality rate in Korea due to suicide. As you can see, in comparison to the OECD, which is the overall average for Organization for Economic Cooperation and Organization, only 29.5% of 15-year-olds in South Korea perceive their health as very good, which is very low in comparison to the 68% in the other countries. South Korea is also the highest suicide-related mortality rate amongst the OECD countries. 95% of Koreans report being stressed with staggering rates of depression amongst the elderly. Today, nearly 40 Koreans commit suicide every day. This is 3 times higher than the US.
But how does this affect us as Korean Americans? Well, there are first some differences between South Korea and the United States that we should address. So in South Korea, treatment is becoming more accessible, as we said, with more psychiatric clinics opening up. But the stigma is still not improving. In the US, however, treatment is not very accessible as it is very costly, and 74% of Americans think that it is inaccessible for such medical services, and 47% believe that the accessibility is limited because of reasons such as the waiting times. And although some stigma remains in the US, there are only mostly positive views on mental disorders. The majority, 87%, believe that mental health is equally important as physical well-being, and Western views are becoming more accepting of the mentally ill.
So there are several barriers that carry over from South Korean stigma and limitations in general which affect Korean Americans in the US today. With South Korean beliefs are continuously maintained in the United States, with South Koreans characterizing themselves as intelligent, industrious, and in charge of their own lives. They uphold themselves to a specific standard and then refuse to seek for help, as they believe is admitting to weakness and letting down those around them. These Korean beliefs are upheld even past immigration, past America, leading to Korean Americans refusing help and assistance in the fear of being seen as weak. Alongside this issue of South Korean beliefs being maintained past immigrational generations, the issue of language barriers also presents itself as a major issue to Korean Americans. Some who freshly immigrate struggle and lack the ability to communicate and understand English. Therefore, once met with an English-speaking therapist in America, they could struggle to comprehend the help that they are receiving. And alongside this, the language barrier brings one to be unable to fully express their needs and their own issues. Therefore, they could potentially be misdiagnosed as they cannot fully explain the struggles that they are experiencing. Lack of detailed explanation can bring them to just use broad topics, broad words, and therefore it can lead to underdiagnosis, overdiagnosis, or other misdiagnoses in general.
There are also cultural barriers for Korean Americans living in the US because South Korea and the United States hold very different values. They also have varying different ways to deal with emotion. While the US mainstream psychotherapy by saying like talking about it will make you feel better, South Korea neglects mental illnesses and escapes them through other means such as academics and sports. Lack of awareness, and also mental health care providers have no insight into the Korean American society, which means that it's more difficult to give the proper assistance in treating ones with their mental illness. So having the ability to read nonverbal communication and behaviors is a great characteristic for mental health care providers to have, as it will help them have the correct diagnosis. Lack of awareness is yet another barrier for Korean Americans. Many Korean Americans don't know where or how to get their treatment in the US, which prevents them from receiving their needed treatment. Numerous Korean Americans also don't seem to know the purpose of getting treatment because they think like, why do I have to pay for it? Because they think that I could just talk to like their family or friends and they don't see the purpose in paying. Generational experiences of hardship is also another barrier because it prevents younger patients from seeking mental health treatment. Many first-generation Asian Americans, including Korean Americans, experience trauma as immigrants adapting to life in a foreign land. Because their parents and grandparents have overcome countless struggles during their immigration process, they fear that their mental health struggles are less significant compared to theirs, and they may feel guilty when they share those things. Another barrier for Korean Americans is the model minority myth. This is the assumption or stereotype that all Asian Americans have educational success and economic stability. Many Korean Americans most likely have been exposed to such prejudice in the US starting from a young age. They are stereotyped as naturally smart and put together, and such stereotypes put an immense amount of pressure on Korean Americans to meet these societal standards.
The impact on Korean Americans. So though traditional beliefs are implemented in Korean Americans' mentality, there are also some factors that can change how they perceive mental illness. For example, shorter residence in the U.S. and higher levels of depressive symptoms subconsciously creates negative attitudes toward mental health services, in comparison to a longer residence in the U.S. and more fluency in English, which creates more positive perceptions toward mental health services. Age also plays a factor where older adults are less likely to access mental health services than younger adults. This is not only due to the stigma that the elderly or the older generation cannot have mental illness.
So with stigma being so deeply rooted within South Korean society, there's no short-term way to truly mitigate stigma. Despite this, South Korea can help mitigate stigma by putting greater contribution towards mental health care delivery. As mental health care is so unprioritized, funding and attention towards the mental health care sector currently resides in South Korea's non-profit section. This leads to underfunding, and attention for mental health care is continuously pushed aside compared to other main Korean affairs. If South Korea aimed for a broader public-private approach on mental health care funding and delivery, the industry would thrive much better, and public-private approach could bring donation from South Korea's well-known corporations and smaller private companies. This brings flow of donation from large and small companies, and therefore more attention can be brought upon mental health care delivery and more funding can be contributed towards it. Now, alongside this, a public-private approach brings much more influence to the general public. Therefore, much more attention can be given towards mental health care. Now, the solution for destigmatization must also be made long-term with structural reforms so that the impact lasts for a while. By education to the public, South Korea can eliminate stigma from its source as more awareness is raised for those who are struggling. Education to the public on significance of these issues through social media, influencers, or chaebols can bring South Korean society to care much more about these mental health issues in general. Now, as Korea should take these efforts upon eliminating stigma within their own society, America should also work on their own mental health care industry to help out Korean Americans. South Korea aims to work towards spreading information on mental health to the public, and adding support services for those who are struggling, and raising funds in general to contribute to mental health care. As for America, they should work to increase government funding and to create more accessible mental health care delivery in general, especially for those who are struggling from language barriers. Through higher funding, they can work to provide proper training to service providers on how to address culturally specific issues and how to cross these language barriers to properly assist them in these problems.
By understanding what stigmas are and how it impacts us as a community, we can shed more light on the importance of mental health and receiving proper treatment.